The dust hung so thick over the crossroads that August afternoon that a man could taste the county in his teeth. And yet not one of the 40-odd farmers gathered at the Halloran Commons made a sound as they waited on the answer of a woman they had spent a year calling a fool. She stood on the tailgate of her wagon, with the sun laying its full weight on her shoulders, and behind her up the slope the low chuckling grunt of the hogs carried down over the parched grass like the only living water left in the valley. Every man there had come to beg. Every man there had once laughed. And the woman named Wren Adley let the silence stretch because she understood now what the land had been trying to tell her since the day she arrived. That being right is its own slow kind of reply, and that a debt of scorn is paid not in anger, but in the patience to outlast it. She did not raise her voice. She never had. But before she gave them their answer, we must go back across the whole burnt turning of a single year, to the morning she handed over nearly every dollar she owned for 90 animals that everyone agreed were already as good as dead. It was the last week of an ordinary autumn, when Wren Adley came up the wagon road into Coldwater Valley with 2 trunks, a sway-backed mare, and $41 folded flat inside her boot. She was 32 years old, and she had buried a husband and a way of life 3 counties east, and she had bought, sight nearly unseen, a 160-acre parcel that the land office described as improved and that every honest neighbor described as ruined. The improvement amounted to a stone house with a caved roof over the lean-to, a well-gone brackish, and 80 acres of the poorest, most gravel-shot upland in the district, ground so thin and stony that the previous 3 owners had walked off it in turn, each one leaving a little more of the topsoil to blow away behind him. The remaining acres tilted down toward a dry watercourse that had not run in living memory. She paid $200 she did not have, promising the balance against a note held by the very institution whose agent would spend the coming year trying to take the whole thing back. And then, because the parcel came with them and no one else would haul them off, she paid $30 more for 90 hogs. They were a sorry catalogue of animals. There was the old boar, with the split ear and the ribs you could count from the road, and the lean sows, with their backbones standing up like the ridgepole of a tent, and the shoats, too weak to squabble at the trough, and a scattering of piglets that squealed thin and gave up quickly. The man selling the parcel had let the herd go feral half a season, and they had rooted the near paddock down to bare stone, and eaten the bark from the fence posts, and their eyes had the dull glaze of creatures that have made their peace with hunger. 90 head, $30. That came to $1/3 apiece, and any man in the valley would have told you she had overpaid by $1/3, because a starving hog on gravel ground in a dry year is not livestock. It is a burial detail waiting on a shovel. Wren did the arithmetic standing at the fence in the failing light. 90 mouths. $41, less the 30 she had just spent, less what the mare would eat, less what she would eat, against a note that came due in 11 months and would take everything if it was not met. The numbers did not balance. They did not come close to balancing. But she had learned, in the county she had left, that a ledger which cannot be made to balance by arithmetic must sometimes be made to balance by faith, and by work, and by the stubbornness of staying when leaving is the reasonable thing. The scorn began before she had unpacked the second trunk. It found its loudest voice in a broad, ruddy, prosperous man named Galt Rennick, who ran the finest herd of white-faced beef cattle in Coldwater, and who considered himself, not without cause, the measure of what a man could make of that valley. Rennick had watched 3 owners fail off the gravel parcel, and he had expected to buy it cheap when the note fell in, and the arrival of a lone woman who had gotten there first sat in him like a stone in a boot. He came by on a Sunday. Under the pretense of neighborliness, sat his good horse at her broken gate, and looked at the hogs, and then at her, and let a grin spread slow across his face. "A woman alone," he said, "up here on the skull of the county, with 90 dead hogs and a caved roof." It was not a question. He said it the way a man reads a verdict already handed down. Then he offered, out of what he called Christian charity, to take the parcel off her hands for the price of her note, and not a cent above, so she could go home before winter taught her a lesson the valley had already taught 3 grown men. Wren stood in her doorway with her sleeves rolled and her hands, which were not soft, folded in front of her. And she told him, "No thank you," in 4 plain words, and went back inside. The story of it was all through the Crossroads store by Tuesday, and the phrase, "a woman alone," attached itself to her like a bird to a saddle blanket, and men said it, and laughed, and the laughter was the kind that is meant to be overheard. She let them laugh, because the work would not wait for their opinion of it. That first month nearly finished her. She patched the lean-to roof herself, hauling shakes up a ladder that swayed, and she cleared the choked springboks at the brackish well, until her hands cracked and bled, and she wrapped them in strips of the second trunk's lining. She rose in the black before dawn to carry water to the hogs from the one seep that still gave a slow brown trickle a quarter-mile down the dry watercourse, 2 buckets at a time, 90 mouths, and by the time she had watered the last of them, the first were thirsty again. The weak ones died. She lost 11 head in the first 3 weeks, and dragged each carcass to the far gully and stood over it, doing the grim arithmetic 90 down to 79, 79 down to 74, and the note no smaller for any of it. One gray morning, near the end of that month, she sat down in the cold mud of the paddock with an empty bucket in her lap, and did not get up for a long while, and she came as near as she ever came to walking off that hill the way the others had. And then the old boar with the split ear, whom she had not named and did not intend to, walked over the frost-stiff ground and stood in front of her and rooted once deliberately at the gravel, between her boots, and looked up at her with an expression she could only call patient, as if to say the ground was not finished with either of them yet. She got up, she filled the bucket, she kept going. That, she would say later, was the whole of it, that the getting up was the only real decision she ever made, and she made it 100 mornings running. It was in the 2nd month that the elder came. His name was Emmerich Vasek, and he had come to the valley from the old country 40 years before, with nothing but a knowledge of pigs bred into his blood across a dozen generations of Bohemian hill farmers, and he lived alone at the head of the next draw with a garden that had never once failed even in the driest years, which the valley found unsettling enough that it left him mostly alone and called him, behind his back, the old wizard. He did not laugh when he came up her road. He walked the paddock fence slow, with his hands behind his back, and he looked at the hogs a long time, at the way they moved, at the set of the old boar's shoulders, at the shape of the young sows under their poverty. And when he was done looking, he turned to Wren and said something no one else in Coldwater would have said. "These are good animals," he told her, in his soft, deliberate, accented cadence. "Starved, yes. Ruined, no. There is a difference the eye must be taught to see." Then he said, the thing she would carry through the whole of that year, the thing she would come to understand only slowly, the way you come to understand a language by living inside it. "The land remembers," he said, "what the farmer forgets, and it will not shout the answer to you. It only whispers, so you must learn to be quiet enough to hear it." He took a handful of her thin gravel soil and let it run through his fingers, and he smiled a little as though the dirt had told him a joke. "Do not fight this ground," he said. "It has beaten better fighters than you. Let the pigs do what pigs were made in the beginning to do, and stand back and watch and count nothing until the ground is finished counting." She did not fully understand him, but she trusted the way he had looked at the boar, and so she made a change that every neighbor who saw it counted as further proof of her foolishness. Instead of penning the herd tight the way beef men penned their weak stock, she opened the inner fences and let the hogs range the gravel upland in a loose band, moving them by degrees across the parcel, the way Vasek showed her, a few acres at a time, so that they rooted one stretch thoroughly and then were moved to the next before they ruined it. The hogs, given their freedom, did what their nature intended. They rooted. They turned the thin, stony soil over with their snouts in great churning arcs, working manure and last year's dead grass, and the seeds of things down into ground that had been beaten hard and barren for 20 years. Where the beef men saw destruction, Vasek had taught her to see plowing, the oldest kind done for free by animals who asked nothing but to be moved and to be let alone. Slowly, so slowly that no one down at the crossroads could have marked it, the upland began to change. It was invisible from the road. It was invisible to Galtarenik when he rode by. But underfoot the ground was waking, and Wren, learning to be quiet enough, had begun to hear the first of what it had to say. Somewhere in that turning, she stopped being entirely alone, and it was a child who ended it. He was a thin, watchful boy of 10 named Tobias, the youngest of the Hakes down the road, a family so poor and so hard luck that the valley pitied them the way it despised Wren from a comfortable distance. The boy took to slipping up her wagon road in the long afternoons, saying nothing, standing at the fence, and then, when she did not shoo him off, climbing through it to help. He had a gift for the animals that startled her. He named them every one over the weeks, so that the herd she had refused to make her own acquired a whole population of names out of a 10-year-old's imagination, and the old boar with the split ear became in the boy's mouth King Solomon. On account of he looked, Tobias said, like he was always about to hand down a judgment. Wren protested that you did not name what you meant to sell. The boy considered this and said that you named them, so you would remember them after they were gone, which he considered the whole point of anything, and she found she had no answer. For that, and so King Solomon he remained. The boy came every day, the light allowed. He never once said the thing the men said. He looked at her method, and at her hogs, and at the churned-up ground, and he plainly thought it made sense. And in the loneliest stretch of that year, the uncomplicated faith of one poor child did more to keep her on the hill than any arithmetic could. The winter broke hard and dry, and the spring that followed came in thin, and the old-timers at the store began cautiously at first to speak of a coming drought, the kind that arrives, they said, like the open door of a furnace. Wren heard it and set it aside, because she had a nearer problem, which was that her animals, ranging free and rooting the upland, had begun to thrive in a way that made no arithmetic sense against the state of the ground and the water. She had learned to catch the seep water and the little rain in a series of hollows the hogs themselves had helped to dig, and the herd had put on flesh over the winter that the valley would not have believed, and in the early spring the sows farrowed and farrowed well, litter after litter of strong, squalling piglets. And the 74 head that had survived the winter became, by the counting of the second month of spring, 130 and rising. She kept it quiet. She kept it the way Vasek had told her, banked low and covered like a coal under ash, giving no smoke for the valley to see. When Rennick rode by, she made sure the strongest stock was up in the folds of the far upland where the road could not reach it, and she let him see only the culls near the gate and the caved roof and the woman alone, and she let his grin stay wide, because a secret kept is a secret that keeps working. It was in the deep of that dry spring that the ground finally finished counting and told her what it had been whispering all along. The hogs had for a week been drawn again and again to a particular low bench of the gravel upland near the head of the dead watercourse, rooting it and returning to root it again, working a widening patch down past the stone to the raw subsoil, and Wren, who had learned to be quiet enough to notice such things, went up one evening with the boy to see what it was that pulled them so. The churned gravel at the bottom of their digging was dark. It was wet. She knelt and put her cracked hand flat against it, and felt the cool of it climb into her palm, and when she scraped a hollow in the low place, it filled, slowly, patiently, with clear, cold water that welled up out of the gravel from somewhere deep below the reach of any drought. The hogs, ranging and rooting where no plow had ever gone, had opened a gravel spring that ran off the shed-water of the whole high country and lay hidden beneath a cap of hard pan that 20 years of surface farming had never once broken. She sat back on her heels beside the boy in the failing light, and she understood then all at once everything Vasek had meant, the land had remembered, a water it had held all along. The despised hogs had been the only creatures patient and lowly enough to dig for it. And the old deeds, drawn up by surveyors who measured only what the eye could see from horseback, had never mapped a drop of it, because you cannot map what you have not troubled to look for underfoot. She said nothing to anyone but the boy, and a day later, to Vasek, who came up and looked at the seep and knelt and drank from his cupped hand and was quiet a long time. Then he stood and wiped his mouth and said, "So, the ground has spoken, and now you must decide what kind of a listener you are going to be." She did not fully take his meaning then. She took it only to mean that she must protect the spring. And so through that spring and into the first hammer blows of the drought, she built up the low bench by hand, wringing the welling gravel with stone, digging catch basins below it, so that the water pooled and held instead of sinking away. And the modest miracle of it was that the more the herd worked the ground, the stronger the water came, until she had, by midsummer, a running spring where the deeds swore there was nothing but dead upland, and a stock tank below it that stayed full while the whole valley went to dust. The first proof of her animal's worth, in the only language the valley respected, came from a stranger. A drover named Cassius Boone, buying stock for the railroad camps 2 counties west, came up the valley in early summer looking for hogs and finding, to his sour surprise, that the drought had left the penned herds thin and fevered and hardly worth his trouble. Someone at the store, half in mockery, told him about the woman with the wild hogs up on the skull of the county, and Boone rode up, expecting a joke, and stopped his horse at her fence and did not laugh. He knew what he was looking at. He walked among her ranged stock, at the deep clean-fleshed sows and the strong shoats, and King Solomon presiding over all of it, like the judgment the boy had named him for, and he ran his hands over their backs, and looked at their eyes and their feet, and he named a price per head that made Wren go still. It was 3 times what the best penned hog in cold water would fetch in that dry year, because her animals, ranged and watered and grown slow on turned ground, were sound clear through where the others were hollow. She sold him 50 head, kept back her breeding stock, and King Solomon, and rode down to the store the next morning to lay coin against her note in front of witnesses. And the arithmetic that had refused to balance for a year came, all at once, out even and then ahead. The men at the store did the sum in their heads and stopped laughing in the middle of it. Being right, she had learned, is its own slow reply, and it had just spoken loud enough for the whole crossroads to hear. The drought came on then in earnest, exactly as the old man had promised, the door of the furnace standing open over the whole county from the 1st of July. The grass burned brown, and then white, and then to nothing. The beef-men's tanks cracked and dried, and their fine, white-faced cattle stood at empty troughs bawling, and the sound of it carried across the valley day and night. Wells that had never failed. The Seep Wren had first carried water from went dry as a bone, and the crossroads store began selling hauled water by the barrel, at prices that climbed by the week, and men who had laughed the autumn before now sold cattle for 1/10 of their worth to buyers who could smell the ruin or watch them die in the field. And up on the ruined gravel parcel that 3 men had walked off, the spring the hogs had dug ran cool and steady through it all, and the stock tank below it stayed brimming, and word of it, which cannot be banked forever, began at last to come down off the hill. Galt Rennick came first, but he did not come to beg. He came to buy, and when that failed, he came to take in 3 tightening waves that showed the valley at last what kind of man he was under the ruddy neighborly grin. The first wave was money. He rode up in his good coat and admired the spring with a proprietary eye and offered her a sum for the whole parcel that was, this time, generous. More money than she had ever seen, framed as a favor, to a woman who surely wanted nothing more than to be quit of so much hard trouble. She told him no thank you, in the same 4 words, and he stopped smiling. The second wave was rumor. Within the week, Crossroads was full of talk that the water on the skull of the county was bad, tainted, that stock drunk from it would sicken, that the woman was a fool who did not know what her own ground held, and Wren knew where the talk had started because it was too detailed, too knowing, and it named the very bench where the spring rose. And no one had been up there but her, the boy, Vasek, and the man who had ridden up to buy. The third wave was law, or the color of it. Rennick, who sat on the waterboard the county had hastily convened when the wells began to fail, produced an old survey and a theory that the head of the watercourse, being a natural water source in a declared emergency, fell under the board's authority to allocate for the common good, by which he meant his own good. And he came up the road a third time, with 2 other boardmen and a paper, and told Wren Adley that the spring was going to be managed by the board at a fair price to those who paid, whether she liked it or no. He had overreached, and it was the boy who caught him at it, though Wren was the one who understood. In the course of his lawyering on her own doorstep, meaning to prove his familiarity with the matter, Rennick let slip that he knew the spring gave, by his estimate, near 400 gallons in a day, and Tobias, standing at the fence, said plain and loud that nobody had measured it but him and Miss Wren. One evening 2 weeks back, with a bucket and a count, and they had made it 380, and how did Mr. Rennick come to a number so close if he had never been let up to see it? The 2 boardmen looked at Rennick. Rennick's face went the color of his coat. He had been watching the bench with a glass from the ridge, or worse, sending a man up in the dark, and his too precise figure had confessed it in front of witnesses more surely than any oath. He gathered his papers and his dignity and rode off the hill, and the matter of the board's authority went strangely quiet after that, but the drought did not, and the valley's need only grew, and Wren knew the reckoning was not finished, only postponed until the day the whole county was thirsty enough to come to her together. The humbled one came before the crowd did, and it was, of all men, Rennick's loudest lieutenant from the year before, a boastful cattleman named Del Corey, who had led the Crossroads laughter and coined half the jokes about the woman alone and her dead hogs. He came up the road on foot, having sold his last saddle horse for water, with his hat in his 2 hands, and he could not at first make his mouth say what he had come to say. His cattle were dying, 40 head of them, and his children were drinking hauled water, measured by the cup, and he had no money left to pay for either. And he finally got out, to ask the woman he had mocked whether she would let him water his stock at her tank on credit he did not know how he would ever repay. He stood there waiting for her to gouge him, waiting for the year of scorn to come back on him tenfold, because that was what he would have done, and it was written plain on his face that he knew it. Wren looked at him a long moment. "Brr!" Then she said, "Bring them up in the morning, and there is no charge for water in a dry year. Only for the trouble of hauling it, and if you have hands to help me keep the basins clear. That will be payment enough." Del Corey put his hat back on so she would not see his face, and went down the hill and brought his 40 head up at first light. And they drank, and he stayed and worked the basins beside her, and he was the first man in Coldwater Valley to call her Miss Adley, without a sneer buried in it. Word of that ran downhill faster than any rumor Rennick had planted, and so it was that on the burning August afternoon where this account began, the whole valley came up the wagon road together, 40-odd families with their thirst and their shame and their dying stock, to stand at the Halloran Commons below her spring and ask, all at once, for, the thing they had once said, she was a fool to want. And Galt Rennick came, too, at the head of them, and he had made a plan of it, for he was not a man to be beaten by decency, if cunning could be found. He stood up before the gathered valley, and proposed, in his warmest voice, that the community and the water board together purchase the spring from Miss Adley at a handsome price, and that the board then manage its sale fairly, by the gallon, to all who needed it. And he named the handsome price. And Wren saw the tired, thirsty faces turn to her, and saw some of them, God help them, begin to hope she would take it, because a spring owned by the board was at least a spring they might buy from, and a spring owned by a woman alone was a thing they had spent a year teaching themselves to resent. She let the silence stretch up there, on her tailgate with King Solomon's herd chuckling behind her. And then she gave them her answer, and it was not the one Rennick had planned for. She said that the spring was not hers to sell. Not truly, because she had not made it. The Hogs had made it, the Hogs everyone had called dead, digging in the ground everyone had called ruined. And the ground had held that water all along, waiting for someone patient enough to let it be found. She said she would not sell it to the board, because a thing that all of them needed to live should not be owned by a few of them to profit from. And she looked straight at Rennick when she said it, and she asked him, in front of them all, how a man who had never been let up to see the spring had come by the exact measure of its flow. And let that question hang until every face in the crowd remembered the boy at the fence and did the sum. Then she turned back to the valley and told them the water was theirs, all of them, free, for as long as the drought held and after it, and that all she asked was that those who took it help keep the basins clear and the ground above them rooted and whole, and that they leave her hogs be, and call them by their names if they cared to. For the boy had named every one. It was payment for the labor of it, she said. Not for the gift, because the gift was never hers to charge for. The tide of the whole valley turned in the space of a breath. Men who had laughed the autumn before took off their hats there in the dust, one after another, without a word spoken to make them do it. Del Corey stepped up beside her wagon and turned to face the crowd, as if daring any of them to say a word against her, and none did. And Galt Rennick, who had walked up that hill at the head of a county, and expected to walk down owning its only water, found that the ground had shifted under him entire, that his money was worth nothing against a free gift, and his cunning nothing against the truth a 10-year-old had spoken at a fence. And he got on his good horse, and rode down off the skull of the county, in a silence louder than any laughter, and the valley let him go, and did not follow, and did not ask him back. He was beaten, and he had been beaten not by force, nor by law, nor by money, but by simple decency, which is the only thing that beats such men for good. The rains came in the last week of September, 3 days of them, soft and gray and steady, and the whole valley stood out in it, with their faces turned up like children. The dead watercourse ran again for the first time in living memory, fed at its head by the gravel spring the Hogs had opened, and the burnt ground drank and greened, and the arithmetic of that hard year came out, in the end, to more than any of them could have added at the start. Wren Adley met her note with room to spare and held her 160 acres free and clear, and her herd, ranged and rooting and watered, grew fat and famous, and drovers came up the valley now on purpose, and the phrase "a woman alone," which had been a burr for a year, wore smooth in the mouths of the valley until it meant something nearer to respect than to scorn. The boy Tobias came every day still, and named the new litters, and King Solomon presided over the whole of it from the shade of the mended lean-to, like the judgment he had always been. And old Emeric Vasa came up one evening in the green of the following spring, and stood with her at the fence, looking out over the turned and living upland, and he was quiet a long while in the way he had, and then he said, soft in his old country cadence, "You asked me once what kind of listener you were going to be, and now the ground has answered for you. The farmer who fights the land takes from it once and leaves it poor. The one who listens to it is given the same water forever." She did not answer him, because there was no answer needed. She only stood and listened to the spring running cool below the bench in the failing light. The water, the deeds had never mapped and the eye had never seen, whispering up out of the gravel the way it always had, for anyone patient enough and lowly enough and stubborn enough to get up one more morning and dig.
Car j'ai commencé aussi, mais attends, je reprends après la ciné, Micha, d'accord? Je sais. Je te réponds, Micha. Bah non, je change pas mes horaires, Alix. Tu seras pas là jusqu'à la fin, mais je change pas, je vais pas live cet après-midi. Ok, donc ça c'est un œuf de dragon, si je suis bien l'histoire. C'est très très calme. On arrive.